third of our historic landscape speaker series. So our season this year is themed around looking at the cultural landscapes of the past, the people who inhabited Wisconsin 190 years ago, looking at the natural landscapes in which the history lived out. And so we've heard about a couple of different perspectives on this topic in previous weeks, and we're looking forward to hearing from Matt Blessing, retired state archivist and division administrator of the Wisconsin Historical Society, about Aldo Leopold's use of history in understanding landscapes, using landscapes to understand history. So, really glad to have you. Looking forward to it.
Okay, great. How's everybody doing? Yeah. I was just telling Mr. Dorn, who was on my search committee when I applied for state archivist 12 years ago, so he's always Mr. Dorn. That I retired 2.5 years ago. This is my first presentation since the COVID bug came around the planet. So I'm a little nervous. Haven't been on my feet giving a presentation in a long time. And I figured that rather than rush through the credits at the end of my talk, I want to get started by crediting my Aldo Leopold mentors. That's the family home in 1968. That's the brand new Chevy station wagon of 1969 with my dad standing in front of his candy apple red Chevy. Looking at, I think everybody in the room will, maybe there's one or two who won't know the expression the way back. The way back of the station wagon. I was the youngest in the family, so I was always in the way back. There was a third seat back here with little pockets in the side. And my dad wasn't much of a deer hunter, but he went out every year with his thermos of Sanka and probably had his nose in a Sand County Almanac, which in 1969 and 1970 came out in paperback after 20 years, and it started actually selling, and it came out in Oxford edition and used it in paperback. And for what seemed like 5 or 6 years, there was a bush-worn copy of a Sand County Almanac, just like this, in one of these side doors. And I'm going up to Vilas County after this talk. It used to take a lot longer when the Highway 51 went through Stevens Point and Tomahawk and Merrill. And this was the only book in the car. And I mean, I was only 9 or 10, but out of boredom, I would pick it up. And I was always drawn, again, part of it was the age, to Leopold's chapter, Good Oak, which, if you know Leopold, you know the essay, where I'm going with this. There's 2 sawyers out on the land, which is about 7 miles as the crow flies up the Wisconsin River, down the Wisconsin River. And they're sawing through an 80-year-old log. And as the saw is cutting through the tree rings, he's telling you Wisconsin history. So this is 1945 that they're sawing along. They're a couple inches into this big black oak. And it's stuff like this. Now our saw bites into the 1870s, the decade of Wisconsin's carousel in wheat. Monday morning came in 1879 when cinch bugs, grubs, rust, and soil exhaustion finally convinced Wisconsin farmers that they could not compete with the virgin prairies further west on the game of weeding the land to death. I suspect that this farm played its share in that game, and that the sandblow just north of my oak had its origin in overweeding. This same year, 1879, saw the first planting of carp in Wisconsin, and also the first arrival of flatgrass as a stowaway from Europe. On October 27th, 1879, 6 migrating prairie chickens perched on the rooftop of the German Methodist Church in Madison and took a look at the growing city. On November 8th, the markets at Madison were reported flooded with ducks at 10 cents apiece. In 1878, a deer hunter from Sauk Rapids remarked prophetically, "The hunters promised to outnumber the deer." And it goes on and on like that. And this is one of my, for a guy that spent almost 40 years in public history, this is one of the first introductions to Wisconsin history. And that was in the back seat of the station wagon. Fast forward 45 years, and I was with the Wisconsin Historical Society. As Adam said, I was the library director and the state archivist. And I had studied Leopold, I had studied conservation and environmental history in graduate school, but I was spooked of Leopold because in Wisconsin, you better know your stuff if you write about Aldo Leopold. And the board of directors of the Wisconsin Historical Society had one of their meetings in Portage. So we came here, took the tour, it was great. Stayed at the motel up by the interstate, and then the next day we had a meeting at the Aldo Leopold Center. Typical, boring board business, budgets, strategic plans, and things that the staff sit in the back row and take a little nap. And then we broke for lunch, and it was this very informal setting, screened porch, picnic tables, boxed lunches, plastic utensils, you get the idea. And I looked up at my picnic table, and Estella Leopold, Jr., the youngest of Aldo and Estella Leopold's children, who is now a retired paleobotanist at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's sitting down across from the picnic table, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm the luckiest guy in this room, because she has a wicked sense of humor. Not only was she a photogenic 11 or 12-year-old, her brother Carl took the German camera that her father brought back from Germany in 1836 and made all these wonderful photographs of Estella with her pet crows and her pet squirrels. And she sat down and she said to me, she knew I was from the Historical Society, she said, you know, somebody ought to write about my father's interest in history. And that set me on a little journey. And a couple of years later, I had the confidence to advance a PowerPoint to write this article for the Wisconsin Magazine of History that came out in 2020. Like I said, there's a terrific body of research about Leopold. Kurt Meine's works for the Aldo Leopold Foundation. He published the seminal biography of Leopold in the late 1980s. This is an intellectual history of Leopold. There are companions, there are quote books. But I wanted to investigate, because of that early reading of Leopold in the Good Old, what Estella said to me on the other side of the picnic table, that her father was steeped in history and it influenced his work as a forester, as an advocate for wilderness areas, and as a professor of game management. So that's what I kind of set out to do in this article and in my talk tonight. So real quick, if you're not familiar with Aldo Leopold, this is kind of a summary of where I'm going to be going in the next 20 minutes or so. Born into a upper middle class family on the banks of the Mississippi River in Burlington, Iowa in the 1880s. Grows up there surrounded by his parents, younger siblings, and German-American grandparents, kind of a family compound overlooking the Mississippi River. Goes off to an elite boarding school, to Yale University, which had one of the great science programs at the turn of the century. joined Gifford Pinchot's first generation of foresters for the very brand new U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt. Is in New Mexico and Arizona, bless you, for close to 20 years, rising to becoming a regional forester for the whole southwestern United States. Moves to Madison, Wisconsin for a job that he didn't like. Quits that job with a family of 4 and a baby on the way, young Estella, and writes a textbook that when I went to college in 1981 was still being sold at the University of Wisconsin bookstore. That's how seminal his textbook was. He created the discipline, created the profession of wildlife management. And that textbook gives him a job at the University of Wisconsin as an experimental professor that eventually becomes a permanent position. And he stays in Wisconsin at the university from 1933 until his death, fighting a neighbor's grass fire in 1948. The book, the San County Almanac, is just one of 300 publications. What did they do with the book? He published more than 300 articles during his lifetime. He published a textbook on game management. This book, the San County Almanac, Oxford University Press wrote to him the Tuesday before his death on a Saturday afternoon that they had been accepted for publication. And his second son, Luna, cobbled together the essays and published it posthumously about a year after Leopold's death. As I was starting this little research exercise, I went through the San County Almanac, which is, every time I read it, I learn something new, and I've probably read it 20 times. I read it about 3:15 this afternoon, listened to the reference, and found something new. But when I started the research, I went through it carefully and figured out that more than 60% of the essays are framed as a storyteller using history. And that kind of set me on this journey to look at Leopold through the lens of how is this scientist using history to convey ideas. It's clear and simple. I'm not that smart. I just wanted to basically hone in on how a forester, how an environmental activist is using history to get messages across and to influence people. So that's kind of the basis for where I'm going with this presentation. Although if there's any walk away from this presentation, this is probably it to remember about Aldo Leopold. San County Almanac, again, comes out a year after his death, and what he's best remembered for today is a 22-page essay in the very back of the San County Almanac called Land Ethic. So he's not only a great regional forester, creating the management of, for the profession of wildlife management, Leopold, with the land ethic, becomes a major 20th century philosopher, period. Because what he does is with human ethics, going back to Aristotle, is about the relationship of people. Leopold makes the connection that the land ethic connects the human community with soils, water, plants, animals, or collectively the land. And that concept has completely reshaped what was formerly the conservation movement and now is the environmental movement. The guy that I'm currently studying, a Madison professor, gave a copy of this book to the new director of the Sierra Club in 1950, a year after the book was published, David Brower, the heir apparent of John Muir, and it completely reshaped what David Brower did with the Sierra Club over the next 30 years, based on the land ethic. So that's not where I'm going with this. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not smart enough to talk about it, but that's the central, most important part of who Aldo Leopold is his creation of the land ethic. So diving a little bit deeper, born in the 1880s to this family, they manufactured hardwood desks out of white and red oak that came out of northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota. Logs were floated down to Wisconsin and the Mississippi River, and they were milled and constructed in Burlington, Iowa, and sent all over North America. Some of you might even have a Leopold desk if you explore the back. His father in the center was a sportsman, and he taught Leopold ethical hunting philosophies. This is at a time when birders estimate that there were about 400 million game birds and waterfowl that were killed in the 50 years before the International Migratory Bird Treaty that put game limits. So Leopold has seen immense changes. This is industrial America that he's growing up in the 1880s and the 1890s. The prairies in Illinois to the east and Iowa to the west are falling to cornfields thanks to J.I. Case and Cyrus McCormick. The Corps of Engineers are damming major portions of the upper Mississippi River to move commodities to market. Leopold is experiencing all of this. I'm going to be talking a lot about history tonight because that's what I am and that's what I do, but it's one of my pet peeves when I read a lot of environmental writing. There's a complete lack of context of the past. And there's too much, in my opinion, too much presentism in a lot of science and environmental writing. And Leopold, it's really important since he's living through this era to kind of get a sense of what he's experiencing as a youth. He's the oldest. He's homeschooled by his mother up until about age 12. She's reading him Goethe and German novelists. He's interested in Daniel Boone and Western exploration. But by the time he gets to Burlington High School, he's one of the star students. He gets out of high school, the public high school, at age 17, and he goes off to central New Jersey to Lawrenceville Preparatory School. It's one of the big old prep schools in the East, and he's simply trying to kind of shore up his classical education before he enrolls at Yale. It's a really instrumental year at age 17. 17 is an instrumental year for a lot of us, right? As Marty once told me, we're still 30 years away from the invention of the word teenager or adolescent, but it doesn't mean that 17 isn't an influential time in our lives. So he's off by himself at a prep school, and he's from the Midwest, surrounded by people from New England who are of a different sort. And he writes, every other day he's writing letters to his parents, these long, chatty letters. And I contend that just the process of writing 5-6 page letters every 48 hours helps to make him a better writer than just putting pen to paper. He writes to his mother that he's thankful for the expense of them sending him to this prep school because there's a recession going on and Dad's company is not doing well. But he also admits that the English and history instruction at the Burlington High School is superior to the prep school, which this is my little plug for public education. So what does he do? Here's the librarian in me. He goes to the Lawrenceville Library and he finds a copy of Charles, you can tell I'm rusty here, I was going to say Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin's Journey on the Beagle. The whole 5-year trip of the Beagle in the mid-19th century to places like the Galapagos. And he immerses himself in Darwin at age 17. That's Darwin as a much older man with the white beard. From there he goes to Yale, which is the second forestry program in the country. The first was at Cornell, second one is an endowed program by the soon-to-be first U.S. forester, Gifford Pinchot's family. Wanted a bigger program in Cornell, so what you create an endowment at Yale. This is Leopold, his class photo. I think it's 1908, 1909. Sort of interesting that Leopold is the only one in a light gray suit. Everybody else is looking pretty conservative there. Most important thing that happens is forestry is a brand new profession. It's very, very technical. It's game man. It's legal work. There's no forest ecology yet. It's a profession in the United States has been around for about 10 years. The most important influence that Leopold and his contemporaries would have had was reading the works of this guy. Anybody in the audience recognize another large man with a beard? This is not Charles Darwin. Anybody recognize who this is? This is George Perkins Marsh. George Perkins Marsh basically started the American conservation movement, published a book in 1864 called Man and Nature. He was Lincoln's diplomat to Italy, and he was shocked by what he saw in places like Sicily and Naples. He took trips towards Greece. That the whole southern Mediterranean, which he considered once one of the greenest, lushest areas on the planet, all the way over to the Fertile Crescent, places like Iraq, were wastelands because of the way people treated their forests. It just denuded them. The thing is, nobody was reading Marsh when it came out in 1864, except people like Increase Lapham of Wisconsin, who 2 years later published a book about the destruction of Wisconsin's forest, because he was probably one of 6 people in the entire state who had read George Perkins Marsh. But in the 1880s, Marsh's book catches fire because there's much more concern about the rise of monopolies and the loss of American forests, and would there be a crisis in available lumber. And so, what's the point of talking about Charles Darwin and George Perkins Marsh? These are 19th century thinkers who, sort of like Thomas Jefferson, are Renaissance men. They study everything. They're polymaths. They're interested in all aspects of science because science hasn't become specialized yet. They would have called it natural philosophy. They're interested in trees, they're interested in all things botany, they're interested in zoology, they're interested in oceanography. And this is fundamental in shaping Leopold's outlook when he becomes a forester and a professor of wildlife management. Everything matters. All knowledge matters. And Leopold, much later in life, in the 1930s and the 1940s, would end up, this is putting words in his mouth, I think he's biting his tongue in the 1940s when he sees the specialization of anthropologists or botanists who are studying grasses in northern Illinois, that they have to be broad, because his roots are based in people like George Perkins Marsh and Darwin, who studied everything and looked for connections. Then he leaves the grassy lawns of Yale University and goes down to New Mexico as one of the very first U.S. foresters, which had been created under Teddy Roosevelt. There had been forest reserves in the 1890s, but they didn't know what to do with them. When Roosevelt comes into office in 1901, they have an advocate for American public lands, and he starts actually assembling an administration, an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture to manage the forest. And so Leopold is part of that first crop of foresters. First, he goes down to the Apache National Forest, which is right on the New Mexico, Arizona border, and then a few years later he gets promoted and he's north of Santa Fe, more towards the border with Colorado. This is at a time when you were just as likely to be issued a government horse than a Model T. Leopold was fond of his government horse. He named her Holly. And he also starts raising a family. Aldo Leopold was from a very, very distinguished Santa Fe family that you can easily track her genealogy back to Mexican governors, Spanish conquistadors, all the way back 1,000 years to Spain. And so she's interested in history, the family's interested in history, and you better know a little bit about multiculturalism in New Mexico, one of the most diverse places, of course, it's still a territory in the lower 48 when Leopold was coming of age as a young married man. They had their first 4 kids, Starker, Luna, Carl, and Nina, while they were living in Albuquerque. And then Stella, who I spoke about later, is the only one born in Wisconsin. In about 1915, 1916, I'd have to go look at it, Leopold comes down with a serious liver ailment. And basically, to make a long story short, he's no longer able to ride Polly. He has to take an administrative desk job. And so his health is precarious for several years. He actually goes back to the family home in Burlington. And it's during that recuperation, he's only been married for about a year and a half. And Estella and the kids come with him as he's recuperating in Burlington. And he and Estella start this lifelong process that will last for the next 40 years of reading broadly and reading aloud to each other almost every evening. It's during this recovery in 1915 that Leopold gets his first introduction to John Muir, whose boyhood home is about 20, 25 miles straight north of here, just south of Montello. And Leopold, Muir had died a year earlier. In the UW archives where Leopold's papers are, there's all sorts of books of great quotations. This was the thing that you did in the 19th, early 20th century. George Washington did this, made lists of great quotations. Leopold's papers include quotation after quotation by John Muir, the co-founders of the Sierra Club. Just before the family packs up and leaves for Madison, Leopold, as a regional forest, makes a very interesting decision. The first national forest where he had worked at, the Apache, also called the Gila National Forest. This is an age, the 1920s, for some of us, our grandparents' generation, for others, maybe it's a little different. This is an age of boosterism, of road building, of Model T, of don't worry about it, just build the road. And if you look at conservationists from this era, this is their primary concern in the 1920s, is blacktop highways. And Leopold makes the decision to put something like 250,000 acres as a roadless area. This is the early 1920s. This is 40 years before the Wilderness Act of 1964. Because they're so worried that in 10 years, will there be any spot left in the lower 48 that's not accessible by a Tin Lizzie, by a vehicle. He moves to Madison in 1924 to become the assistant director of the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory. So this is not the University of Wisconsin. This is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is to look for new wood products. And this building wasn't built for a few more years, but they were on the west side of Madison. This is still there today. If you're familiar with the west side, this is kind of where University Hospital is. And he was told, just stay put, and the director of the Forest Products Lab is going to retire in a few years, and you can then ascend to the directorship of this federal agency. And he hated it because he finds himself supervising engineers and just chained to a desk. But what he does is he goes into his basement in the evening and he keeps writing. And he basically writes himself out of a job. So, get to this a little bit of something. I want to just back up though. Because a lot of people read Leopold and think, this guy's kind of dour. He's kind of down on the world, he's kind of down on the future. So this is why I think it's important to look at Leopold's life, his adult years, through the historical lens, and what he experienced by the time, 1905, he goes off to Yale, and he dies in 1948. So tremendous amount of concern about dirty water. You can't find a white-tailed deer in southern Wisconsin in the 1930s. Wildlife populations are completely decimated, and will you be able to build a house next year? Will you be able to find 2x4s? World War I and World War II, 150 million people die. You have political revolutions in places like Russia. You have the boom and bust of the 20s and the 30s with 30% unemployment. You have the Dust Bowl. So Leopold's interested in wildlife habitat in places like Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma. And he also has 3 sons who are serving in the South Pacific during World War II. So again, when you read, I hope you do, the San Antonio Almanac, remember this is the world that he's living in. And in the mid-20s, when he's tired of the job at the Forest Products Lab, and he goes on this publishing streak, one of the things he does is he had given a series of lectures at the University of Wisconsin about wildlife management and about decimated game populations. He takes those lectures, expands them, and writes the book that I referenced earlier, Game Management, which was published in 1933, and it's still a valuable book today. So he's creating a profession, and when you create a profession, this is not that uncommon. You need to tell the history of game management. So the whole first chapter is about Chinese Khans and English kings and their game practices in the 12th century and the 7th century Common Era. But Leopold does more than simply use history in a textbook, because he's trying to figure out what was the population density of the American bison, or grizzly bears, or bald eagles that are about to be decimated. And so he needs baseline data. So he's turning back to historical sources like explorers like Kit Carson, and all these sources in the Western United States, Lewis and Clark, to try and figure out what were game populations like before European American contact. And he's going to do that also in Wisconsin. So he becomes a department head of 1, plus a half-time program assistant in the Department of Game Management at the University of Wisconsin. He has, at any given time, he has about 8 to 10 graduate students. And over the next 15 years, he develops this really popular undergraduate course called Wildlife 118. And he starts building an interest. And he's also on Wisconsin Public Radio. Just like being on Larry Mueller today, Aldo Leopold is on Wisconsin Public Radio talking about things like feeding birds in your backyard, which was not a popular hobby back in the 1930s, 1940s. But he's reaching out to the Wisconsin citizens, trying to do outreach. That's all part of the Wisconsin idea. And there are 5 quick examples that I want to talk about how he uses history. The first year that Leopold arrives at the University of Wisconsin campus, a Madison attorney by the name of Michael Olbrich, Olbrich Park is named after, had persuaded the university to pursue federal funds that would lead to the creation of the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, and basically restoring 3 abandoned farms and not trying to create your typical arboretum where there would be 20 different varieties of lilacs for undergraduates to study, but rather to try and recreate the Wisconsin landscape with a prairie, with oak openings, a small pine plantation, which you see by the West Beltline Highway. If you're familiar with Madison, this is Tacoma Road. This is a carriage stop house. Here they're actually using heavy equipment. Leopold was put in charge as research director of the Arboretum. So this is a big assignment. This is getting national attention, a radically different kind of university arboretum. And he speaks at the dedication ceremony in 1933, just months after he takes the position, that we're trying to do something different here. We're trying to create a landscape, rebuild a landscape that reflects what Wisconsin looked like during our grandparents' era, meaning the 1840s, about the time that European Americans started arriving. So the University of Wisconsin Arboretum is based on Wisconsin history. The second thing he does is he's looking for research stations where his graduate students can do research and actually live and work with farmers. And there's a place just north of where I live in Lake Mills called Fable Grove, where Leopold works with a consortium of about 12 dairy farmers. This is just about 5 miles north of Lake Mills. And he's going to try and get them to cooperate so that they can come up with a management plan for these dozen dairy farms to increase game populations of things like pheasants and grouse, and there were prairie chickens at the time. And he puts the first of about 5 different graduate students at Fable Grove. They live in the farmhouse. And he assigns that first graduate student, a guy by the name of Art Hawkins, the task of doing an environmental history of this landscape west of the Crawfish River, which had been a 15,000 acre prairie before the forerunners of this place brought in dairy cows and brought in Eurasian carp and brought in quackgrass. And things are dire in the 1930s. This is a photograph that I made about 3 years ago of the restored prairie. But he's using history at Fable Grove, and they're actually collecting oral history interviews with the farmers engaged in the project. And sometimes the dad or the grandfather is still alive. So this is pretty innovative historical methodology in the 1930s to put a graduate student to work recording interviews of what life was like and what the landscape was like in the 1850s and the 1860s, going that far back. The third location where he puts history to work is at the Shack, which is the location they buy. In 1935, Leopold sells a family hunting property down in southern Missouri. It was just too far back in the day before interstate highways to get down to Missouri to go hunt ducks. But Baraboo beckons, and they buy 80 acres of land on the banks of the Wisconsin River between Baraboo and the Wisconsin Dells for $8 an acre. This gives you a pretty good sense. This is teenage Estella of what the landscape was like. Just kind of raw, sandy, very southern edge of the sand counties. The farmhouse had burned down a few years earlier, but there was a chicken shed that the family spent an entire weekend cleaning up manure, and then a few weekends later they installed a lean-to on the side that served as the bunkhouse. But if you read a Sand County Almanac closely, it's loaded with history, and we can tell Leopold is digging deep into the history of this place, going back to the original Federal Surveyor's maps when the Federal Surveyor came through in the 1830s to figure out what the landscape was like, what the trees were like. And now here we are 85 years later, and I think people like Aldo Leopold would suggest that it's taken almost a century, but the landscape has been restored. And they're doing a lot more further down Levee Road to restore that area for critical bird habitat. But the immediate area that the family started restoring in the late 1930s is looking darn good. I mean, the white pines surrounding the shack are enormous. And then the fourth is here. In the late 1930s, something happens to Leopold. And I'm not sure what. He is given a permanent appointment at the University of Wisconsin. So he's no longer on a year-to-year contract. So that gives him a little chutzpah. He doesn't have to worry about the future. But America's slowly coming out of the Depression. And I think Leopold, as a 19th century man, is frustrated by consumerism and materialism that he's seeing around him on his West Side Madison neighborhood. And his writing becomes pretty edgy. In 1938, 1939, you see this change in him, where it's becoming more forceful and more frustrated with where American society is going. He gets an invitation from the colonial dames, which had established the agency house at 1931, 1932 in there. So, this site had been in existence for about 10 years. Of course, it goes back to 1831, but with the colonial dames managing it, it's about 10 years old. And this is just one little section I want to read. He meets with the colonial dames in downtown Milwaukee. And it's a gloomy talk. He has lantern slides, which are the predecessor of 35mm slides, big glass plates. So you can kind of picture a professor with the lights off, slowly advancing these slides of the abused landscape, especially in western Wisconsin in the driftless area. Projecting lantern slides, the professor offered a sweeping environmental history of abused lands, culminating in images of steep gullies and silted up riverways in rural Wisconsin. But then he gets cheerful. He's speaking to the colonial dames, and concluded he had visited the property, that this property that we're sitting on right now contained a stock of 12 prairie plants on the unplowed parts of the agency property. Turkeyfoot bluestem, little bluestem, prairie clover, lupine, spiderwort, lead plant, flowering spurge, raccoon, and the indigo plant. He urged that the prairie be established as a necessary and logical environment for the agency house. In terms of historical authenticity, a restored prairie made far better sense than an expanse of Kentucky bluegrass. And so imagine, as I was preparing for this presentation, to read on the website that under Adam's leadership, he cleaned out, 3 acres of invasive black locust and started restoring it back to prairie just this year. So it took 81 years, but congratulations. And then to close up, we circle back to a San County almanac. Let's remember, Leopold was a heavy smoker. people age quicker. He starts having some pretty serious health issues when he's in his late 50s. And the 40s were not kind, the 1940s he struggled with a lot of things. The university was decimated, so he loses all of his graduate students. Places like the Fable Grove Research Station fall apart. Farmers are too busy growing crops. There aren't graduate students to work at the research stations. His classes, sorry, he only had one female graduate student, so he really muddled through the World War II years. He's worried about his 3 kids, but mostly he's got this problem book of essays. It's it's a different kind of writing, and he gets rejection after rejection from book publishers for what would become a Sand County Almanac. But every morning, he's one of these middle-aged men that can get by on about 3 hours of sleep. He's up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning and writing with a pencil over yellow legal pad, writing more essays, trying to put his editor's suggestions back onto paper. In 1948, he writes a letter to Ernie Swift, who is the director of the state of Wisconsin's Conservation Department, what becomes the DNR, and he makes a proposal that state of Wisconsin needs to take John Muir's boyhood home near Montello, the first farm near Fountain Lake, and turn it into an ecological and intellectual history of Wisconsin, interpreted that way. There should be a prairie with oak openings, there should be a forest, there should be interpretation about John Muir's My Boyhood and Youth, and it should teach people about the conservation history of Wisconsin. He sends that letter on Tuesday afternoon, and as I said earlier, then at the end of a stressful week, he and Estella Jr. go up to the shack for a weekend retreat, and on a Saturday morning he sees smoke on the neighbor's farm. He gathers his 3-gallon galvanized backpack with water, and most historians think he had a heart attack, and the prairie fire came over him while he was rescued. And so throughout the career, though, the point is he's turning to history to solve problems. First as a forester, didn't get into his case for defending wilderness and American values and what wilderness areas and wilderness areas represent, but then also as a wildlife manager. So that's what I have, and I'll end with this quote from A Land Ethic. This is at the very conclusion of the book. That man is in fact only a member of a biotic team is shown by the ecological interpretation of history. Many historical events explained solely in terms of human enterprise were actually biotic interactions between people and the land. That's 1949. If you look at contemporary, not just environmental history, but the broader sweep of world and American history and what's being published today, why there's a revolution? Well, maybe there was a famine. Maybe what caused that famine was the abuse of the land. You can make connections after connections that go back to how people treated the land that can chart whether civilization rose or maybe it fell very precipitously, very quickly, based on the interaction that the human inhabitants had with the land around them. And so Leopold never had a history class after he got out of Yale. He didn't consider himself a professional historian, although he dined with many of them at the University of Wisconsin. But that concept, kind of radical in 1949, is now widely implanted in the academic and popular historians in the United States. So thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. Thanks for bearing with somebody who hasn't given a presentation in 3 years. And I appreciate it. Any questions?
Did the state do anything with the John Muir that they rejected that? They didn't?
It went into a desk drawer. That's the best that I can figure out. Although probably, I'm saying in the 1960s, early 1960s, Marquette County Parks Department preserved the land. And so it's very nice today. I mean, there's a couple nice interpretive signs, and the Ice Age Trail runs through the property. The second farm, which I have not visited, it's private property. Nothing's happened there. Although I think I do know people who have visited the farm and actually been down there and spent evenings in the basement making his inventions. On the first farm, I'm guessing it's about 100, maybe 200 acres. There's a boat down, so it's a fun place to visit, especially after you've visited the red like more than you use. If you haven't read this is really charming. It's written as a boys' book, so written at like a 8th grade reading level in 1913. People that have better higher reading level than we early 20th century. But it's basically just little stories about being a farm boy in Wisconsin in the 1840s and the 1850s. Anything else?
What was his interest in Europe when he was at the university?
Mostly as a historical document. Thanks for asking that question. It's amazing if you go to the Leopold Archives, which, by the way, was the first major archives in the country to be completely digitized, all of it. And that's how important Leopold is, the federal grant. There are boxes upon boxes of 5x8 index cards, basically of Leopold creating a 1930s, 1940s, we call it an electronic data set, but it's basically just cards of notes. And there'll be 6 cards on the American bison. And there'll be another couple cards on grizzly bears. And then there'll be a ream about the passenger pigeon in Wisconsin. It's about data. So he was taking a book like this and reading it closely and taking note when John Muir tells a story about the loon that he shot, and then took home a story about the loon attacking the cat. He found the cat. But Leopold wasn't interested in the story. Leopold was interested in the fact that there were loons in Marquette County in the 1840s. And, with the brothers hunting deer, we were hunting prairie chickens. He was looking at sources like this as a historical document. And it's one of the things that it's a great piece of Wisconsin history just because he's writing in the first person. One of my goals in life is...
Did they kind of honor Muir at that point?
So Muir moves to California in 1868, 1869. And he only came back to Wisconsin twice because he was dying. Well, his father was dying, but by that time my father was in Kansas City, and he comes back to Madison to visit his mother after her death. A year after Muir died in 1914, the university honored him with the creation of a circle on Muir and Knoll across from Aspen Hall. And I've never seen it, but there's a metal bust of Muir, I think, in one of the life sciences buildings. And Muir's clock desk, this contraption that he had in his dorm room on North Hall, that also came to the Wisconsin Historical Society a year or two after his death. So the university did honor him, and now they tout him as one of the great long. He never graduated. Money in the Civil War got in the way.
I saw in your article about, I think there was a picture of some of Aldo Leopold's books that he used.
I'm sorry.
I saw in your article, I believe there's a picture of some of the books that Aldo Leopold used, and I think I saw Waban in there. Is that something that you've seen that he used for
Yeah,
this?
absolutely. He regularly, both in undergraduate classes and in public presentations, he would have a copy of Waban, and he'd have a copy of John Muir's The Story of My Boyhood, and he would read passages about what the landscape was like pre-1850. And he was particularly interested in Julia Kinsey's account of when the first time she travels from this site to Chicago, because she's writing about a several-day journey across Dane, Jefferson, Walworth County. And there's a place, I think it's around Whitewater, in that area in Walworth County, where there's anxiety among the travel party because they cannot find any wood. It's all tall grass prairie. You know, where typically it would have been white and bur oak and stuff down, but in some places around Lake Geneva, it was just in Sun Prairie. It was just miles and miles of tall grass prairie. And if you're traveling, you're in a pickle if it's October and it's going to get down to 38 tonight and you don't have any fireworks. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. I'll hang out with you.
Thank you all for coming, and don't forget, September 13th, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Patrick John about different perspectives on the historic landscape of the Fox and Wisconsin rivers from the views of some of the early explorers. So it should be another interesting presentation, and thank you to the Portage Historical Society for partnering with this series, and thank you also to the Kohler Foundation for helping make this series possible. So.